Hello, my name is Rebecca Rolnick, and I am here this morning with the wonderful Yvea, the Mad Botanist. And Yvea has some exciting news coming up because you are teaching your plant families in our foods class again, right?
Yes, yes, I
Yes.
am.
So I guess first thing, what are the details on that? When is that starting, and how can people sign up?
So that will be starting oh my goodness, it's going to be like 9 days from now. It will be starting on Wednesday, June. This is June. Wednesday, June the 12th, at 9,
2024
2024. That's right.
for
At
future humans watching this.
exactly. For at 9 a.m. at Pacific time, um, that would be noon Eastern, and other, yeah, and hopefully that time conversion works well for folks. Um, for the next few months, it will be series one. I'll be waiting until after a conference happening in September to teach series two. And I'll be adding on the never before seen series three and four, which are in progress. I'm creating them currently. It's going to be fun.
I did not know that. That's exciting.
I'm really excited about this. So a lot of folks might have already taken series one. I think this will be my third time teaching it, but series two I've only ever taught once before. And so each time we just get a little further.
Oh, hang on a second. Okay, sorry about that. Where were we?
We were talking about, oh yeah, that I'm going to be teaching series one through four coming up,
Yeah,
starting in 9 days. 9 days. I think I'm ready.
you'll be ready. Your classes are awesome.
Thank you.
And they're free, right?
Yes, they are free. Although this year I might accept donations if people choose to give them.
Mhm. So, yes. So, why plant families?
Ooh, that's a good question. Plant families, I choose plant families because it's a good way of beginning to group plants by patterns, to begin to recognize patterns. And that way you're not having to learn a ton of individual species, which might be hard to keep straight. And yet you're not having to learn too big of patterns either. It seems like it's the right amount of detail for people to really begin to look and see plants. That's why I love the families, is because it really helps people begin to see plants and see how they're different from each other and see how they're similar to each other. And then also feel as though they've got a little bit more familiarity with plants as they navigate the world.
Yeah, and I think it is also such a great thing because that's a knowledge that you can carry with you anywhere because there's the same there aren't this all the same plant families all over the world, but there are a lot of them that are in many different places, right? So it's if you go to a different place, if you learn all of the wildflowers or all of the trees or plants for your region and then you go somewhere else and you're like, oh, I have to start all over from scratch. But if you know the families, then you still have like a base of knowledge to go with wherever you go.
Exactly. And then you also have the skills of knowing where to look for patterns. So, even if you have no idea what family that is, how many petals does it have? How many stamens does it have? Or like how are the flowers arranged? What are the leaves like? You begin to have a pattern in mind about how you analyze the plants in front of you, that can help you see them better, um, even if
Yeah,
they're
I think that's such an important skill. Well, wait, let's back up for a second. Out of all of the different kind of organisms and everything that's in nature, like we could choose to spend our time nature journaling, and people are different and interested in all different kinds of things, whether it's clouds or rocks or birds or whatever. Why plants? What makes you so excited about learning about plants?
that's a really good question. Um, Early childhood experiences, I think, where I just got very close to the plants. I remember when I was about 10 or so, my best friend had this idea of, oh, let's go in the backyard and make a garden out there. And so we went to the store, we bought the plants, and after a long time spent taking care of them, I really loved them and considered them to be as my friends. Um, There's something really lovely about seeing a plant respond positively to the care you give.
Mm.
There's also something very soothing about the plants for me, because maybe it's because they don't necessarily move the way animals do. So you can kind of sit there and really just be with them for a long time. And I find that to be super peaceful. Another thing, though, if we're looking at this from a more ecological perspective, is that plants build the ecosystem in a lot of ways. You've got abiotic factors, but majority of the animals that you see living out there live within plants or somehow depend on plants for their food or for their shelter. Um, Plants really do shape our surroundings. And so by knowing the plants, you also know the animals better long term.
Totally agree. I feel the same way too about you said sitting with the plants and being peaceful. And I think I love how you brought up also taking care of the plants because something that I love to think about all the time is like having this reciprocal relationship with the natural world. And I feel like plants are one of the like most direct ways of doing that, of like human nature interaction and interconnection. um like animals and birds, like we still have that, like we're still interconnected with them, but you don't see them as often, you don't get to directly interact with them as often, as like plants have, you could say, taken care of people for our whole human history in so many ways. And we take care of the plants, and it's that back and forth.
Exactly. I agree with that. A lot more direct. Plants are pretty consistent in that you know where they're going to be at any time. You can watch them uninterrupted for longer periods of time, whereas you might not ever see that particular animal again once they dart off.
True, or it's a lot harder to know if they're the same individual. But
Exactly.
if you come back to the plant, they're in the same place every day.
Exactly. Which is not to say that you can't have very deep, of course, a lot of us here know how deep you can have interaction with animals as well. I guess you could say it's sort of different intensity with the plants, in my opinion,
Mm.
way. Or a different flavor of intensity, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Mm.
What's your favorite
And
thing? Oh,
speaking of flavor, I think that brings us back around to the third part of what I wanted to ask about with the name of your class. It's plant families in our food. So you're not just focusing on um plant families in general and wild plants, you're actually focusing on more of the cultivated plants and which I think is really powerful because everybody's familiar with food plants. We eat them every single day. So um and so we already have that really deep connection. Even if you're not somebody who loves to eat your veggies, like I hope everybody at least tries. Um and I love food plants and fruits and vegetables. Or you know breads and wheats, rice. It's there. We all interact with them. So that's why I think it's really powerful that you're not just focusing on the wild species, but it's like an entry point that people are already familiar with. So I don't know if you want to say anything more about that.
just that that's exactly what it is that it's a familiar entry point. And it's a good way to make plants relevant. Because if I were to talk about wild species from the very start, some people who live in my region might have some relationship with them, but otherwise, people are going to hear me. I'm just going to, one of my personal favorites that maybe not a lot of people know is coyote brush. People will hear coyote brush and be like, oh, okay, that's nice. You know, it's not, a lot of people don't have already that relationship with them, so that it seems a lot more abstract. But if I start talking about broccoli, that thing that's right there in front of you that people can picture so clearly, and I start talking about how broccoli are ahead of buds on developed flowers, and that's what we're eating when we eat the broccoli, or the way that the broccoli is the exact same species, just a different cultivar of about 6 other plants that we eat, including Brussels sprouts and cauliflower and some others, cabbage, I believe, then that's when people start to go, wait, really? Because, like you said, it's a familiar entry point to think of the food. Um, and another reason why I value that familiarity to give to people in the beginning is because I know that because there are so many plants in the world, plants can seem really overwhelming and intimidating for folks sometimes to think about how can I possibly make sense of all of these plants, all of this diversity. Start with what you know. And I figure that that's an easier way to learn and a more fun way too, and also a way that sticks in your brain a little bit more. The whole it reminds me of. So we got to make that knowledge sticky.
Right, exactly. That it reminds me of we've got to have once you have something that's in your brain, you can have something else that connects in it. It just gets sucked into your brain so much more easily than if it's not connected to anything. I know Jack has talked about this, like it'll just bounce off.
Exactly. I think I borrowed the term sticky from him too. You got to
Yeah.
make it for your brain. So yeah, that's why that. I considered, I'm still considering if I want to go into slightly more of the wilder species in 3 and 4. But if I do, I'm going to have to be very careful to make them really relatable wild species or species that people are more likely to see or have some kind of connection to. So I'm going to be planning series 3 and 4 very carefully. And it will probably be a gradual shift if I do decide to go more for some wild species. More like, here are some really big families that I think we shouldn't miss because we don't eat them, but they're still around everywhere kind of thing.
They're still like at a family level.
Oh, yes, definitely. Definitely at a family level.
Mhm. Because there are so many plant species in the world, isn't it like I know I've looked this up before. Isn't it like hundreds of thousands of
Some,
species or
yeah.
something about, I remember reading something about the number of species that are actually edible to humans is so much more than the number that most people eat on average.
Oh, yeah. That does not surprise me at the slightest. Like, we at this point we are so into the species that we've managed to modify, or at least around, here in our country, we're into the species that we've modified, but we forget that before that we had to make do with what was already growing there and what was wild. So so yeah, there are so many species that might be considered desperation species that we only eat when we're really desperate, or ones that we don't hear about because they don't make for good commercial products to spread more around the world. They're more local, or just, yeah, just things that we forgot about. So yeah, I totally can imagine that there are more species out there that we can eat than we actually do eat. I remember reading somewhere about how many families there were. I don't know if I'm remembering this wrong, but I think I read that there were something like 420 or 450, and it fluctuates depending on whether you're a lumper or a splitter. And that might not seem like a lot because it's only a few hundred families, but then you think, oh, a few hundred families, and how many genera are within those families, and how many species are within those genres? I don't know anywhere near 400 families. I don't know even half, and I like
That's
that.
so many. I bet very few people in the whole world know all the plant families. But that's the whole point. You don't have to know everything. You can start learning just a few things, and it makes your experience of the world so much richer.
It's true. Although Tony Santoro might know a lot, just as a thought. He's the guy who does crime pays, but botany doesn't.
Oh,
He might know a ton of them, but that'd be a fun question to ask him someday. How many families do you know, Tony?
good
Anyways,
question.
I interrupted you.
Oh, no, no. I was gonna say something a minute ago. Oh yeah, we're talking about like food plants that we don't eat as often. Like in my area, we have pawpaw and we have persimmons that are native, but barely anybody even knows what they are because they're not, they don't transport well, so they're not very commercially viable. But they're they do live around here. So I think I've gotten to try each one of them a couple times in the past. So I feel really grateful I got to try them at least.
Awesome.
That feels really special.
definitely. That I didn't even know that we had native pawpaws here. That's really cool. I think that's really, I mean, in the United States. There's one I keep wanting to try manzanitas, but I've never gotten to yet. We have a whole bunch of manzanitas out here on the coast. Um,
Wait, you can eat manzanitas?
I've been told you can. Um,
Do they have a fruit or something? You talk about manzanitas all the time, but I don't really know what they look like, so I always just imagine them as this kind of like grassy, shrubby thing, and I don't know if that's accurate.
so the manzanitas, they have this really, really rich red bark that kind of gnarls around. Um, it gnarls in the way that an oak tree's branches gnarl sometimes.
Mm.
Um, but they go depending on the manzanita, it's in different sizes. It can either be just right off of the ground, only a little, or it can be towering over people. And they have these tiny oval shaped leaves that contrast with the deep red bark. And the bark's always peeling as well, but very, very lightly, not as heavily as like eucalyptus. Um, and they have these tiny little green fruits, I believe, at least the ones that I've seen do. Um, but what's interesting about them, what might help to picture an exceptionally flat blueberry that is still green, a very small, very flat blueberry.
Hmm.
And I say that for a reason because manzanita is in the blueberry family, the Ericaceae, or that family. So those two are friends or cousins, I should say. Um, there's this one street tree that is grown around here that's also related, called the strawberry tree, of all names. Even though it's not related to strawberries, it's also in the heather family. And they make these little tiny spiky looking um, red fruits. And I didn't know you could eat them until Marley told me that, like 15 years ago in college. And you wait till they're perfectly red and then you can eat them. And people don't know that there's food growing right there in the street. They have no idea.
That's amazing.
When you come here, we'll have to eat them together.
I would love that. One of my favorite things I learned about blueberries, it was like one of those little mind-blowing things. This was actually in Robin Kimmerer's plant class and when I was in college. That the top of the blueberry is the same botanically as the bottom of an apple, where it goes kind of like this, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It like splays out the little bits. I forget what that's called botanically, but I was like, oh, that that makes sense. That's like the same part of the fruit. But on the blueberry, the way we look at the blueberry, it's on top. And on the apple, it's on the bottom.
Yeah. The sepals, the little ring of
Yes.
sepals. I love
From where it used to be the flower.
I love that so much. The When you mention the apple, that makes me especially excited because um, I'm trying to kind of shape my classes a little bit differently each year. And this time I'm thinking it would be good, just in case I've got like beginners who really want a lot more basics, to make each of the classes in the first series focus on an aspect of the plant. And so with the apple family, or the rose family, I'm trying to focus on fruits because of the way that the fruit works in that family being so unique. So I love that you mentioned the apple specifically because the way that the fruit is in that apple is so fascinating. I learned something new the last time I taught the class. It's it has a false fruit. What is around, what's on the end? Okay, you know how when you eat the apple, then you get that one part in the middle that's really, really hard just before the
Like
core.
the core. Just before the core.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that
it's
that
like the apple and then there's like the inner apple.
exactly. And there's a reason for that. That inner apple is the ovary that ripened, but what's
Uh-huh.
around it on the outside, the part that we eat, is not the ovary.
It's
It's a
not.
special, no, it's, I want to say, no, is it a hypanthium? No, I'm not sure that it's a hypanthium. There is an actual name for it, and for some reason I'm blanking on it, but I know it's going to come back to me at some point. It's just hilarious that I can't remember. But I guess you could say that the apple is kind of an accessory fruit in a way. Um, all of that thing on the outside is, maybe it is the hypanthium, is extra flesh that is grown that is not ovary flesh. It's something else. It's
That's really interesting.
And so that's why it's fun to cut the apple, is because then you can see the ovary inside of it in that part that's the inner apple. That is, you'll notice it's the shape of a vase. A lot of ovary of plants are like that. It's really cool.
That's so cool. Hey, everybody who takes your class is gonna learn so much from you.
If nothing else, I hope I get to infect them with a little excitement about it because there's a reason they call me the Mad Botanist. It's my enthusiasm. It's not that I so called know a ton of plants, it's because I'm crazy about them. I want everybody to love the plants as I do, or at least be as obsessed as I am. Yes. Wait.
I think I think you'll achieve that. I think that's the most important part, is being excited about it. I mean, I've always thought any teacher could make any subject interesting if they're really passionate about it. And you are so passionate about plants.
Thank you. They're fun and they're funny. Everybody thinks of plants as being all austere, but they're not. They have drama too. People don't realize that plants are so dramatic.
Just very, very slow drama.
Exactly, like the ants. I still remember that awesome meme that you sent me about if you fall down the hill and you are surrounded by plants, move very slowly so that you will not anger the plant gods. You must consider if you have angered them recently, and if you have, then you must make an appropriate offering. If your offering is not accepted, then you must watch your back for the rest of your days. I want to see that meme again. But yeah, the
I
plant
forgot
gods.
about that one.
That one makes me happy. I want to print it and put it on my wall. Yeah, sorry. I can get way too excited about the plants. So if you want way too much energy about plants, please do come to my class or just talk to me about plants.
I don't think it's too much. I don't think there's such a thing as too excited about plants.
I did a ridiculous comic the other day about my long-term, I won't call it a love affair, I'll call it best frenemyship with poison hemlock.
Mm.
And for people who might be concerned, poison hemlock's not a bad plant. I don't hate it. It's just that that plant's tried to kill me. And so my feelings for it are on the personal level. And so I go out and I pull it up as part of my restoration work. Poison hemlock doesn't try to kill me currently, but it waves at me and I know it's thinking about it. So I did a nice little comic about it that I'll have to share when I remember where I put it. But I'm looking at, okay, this is from Star Wars. So I'm looking at the plant. I'm like, I don't fear you. And the poison hemlock is saying, then you will die braver than most. And that's from
Oh,
Star Wars Rebels.
oh, I saw you post that comic you wrote on Instagram.
It's ridiculous and I love it. But I meant to ask you earlier, what's your favorite thing about plants?
Oh my gosh. Well, I think just like you were saying earlier, they're the base of the whole ecosystem. Like we would not have an ecosystem, at least on land, if it weren't for plants. We wouldn't have anything else. And plants are so cool because unlike, I think if you aren't very familiar with plants, you're like, oh, it's just all that green stuff. Like they all look green, they all look the same, but they are so different, like on the molecular level, because they can't run around like animals to get what they need. They can't run, they can't hide, they can't travel to get resources. So they have to do everything right where they are in one spot for their whole lives. And so they have to do all of these things like biochemically in their leaves to adapt to defend themselves from insects or whatever else. So they evolved to survive, but then just so happens that some of them are good for us that we use for food or for spices and flavors and herbs and for medicine, which we can borrow from that, evolutionary history, which is so cool. And then the fact that there are different species of plants that survive in different places and that um I talk a lot about not thinking of nature as an abstraction, not just saying like, oh, go green and let's recycle and save the planet, because that's way too vague. Although it's a good place to start, but like really getting to know the land and the specific place where you live, and that ecosystem and that community, and getting to know like the dominant plant species in an ecosystem, I think is such an important part of developing that sense of place of like what is this specific habitat type, like what is the bioregion that I'm living in. And um like where I live, it's very much like a maple hemlock forest kind of an area, or there's some grasslands that have like um the grasses and things. Um, but yeah, getting to know the plants, I feel like is such a foundational part of having that sense of place and having that connection to nature as a whole.
I agree, especially because that sense of place or how we think of those are just so much defined by that specific plant community, that combination of plants that you get, and the way that sometimes the plants will only be in a certain little range, and then you can see things change in elevation or moisture.
Mhm. Yeah,
And
or over time through the successional stages of an area. You have a place colonized by the pioneer species and fast growing things, and then becomes kind of a shrubland, and then becomes a young forest, and then becomes a mature forest. I mean, most of us might not get to see that whole process because it take a few hundred years, but at least having an awareness of that, I think it just adds so much richness and also a sense of deep time.
I agree with that so much about deep time, and because plants bear witness to all of that. They
Mhm.
really they shape the place, they bear witness to the place. They are what draw a lot of the animals in, either the animals who are, they're herbivores, and then they followed by the carnivores who are going after those herbivores who wouldn't be there if it weren't for those specific plants. Like, sorry, I'm just thinking about all of the different, like what you
Yeah,
were saying about succession. I was thinking about how in California we used to have controlled burns, um, a lot more than we do now, as part of a lot of the tribal rituals, or not rituals, but just like maintenance, tending the land. And part of that is because if you have those burns, then you bring it so that instead of that land going into forest, you keep it as more grassland and more open meadows. And that draws certain animals in that maybe different tribes wanted to eat, that maybe it would be harder to find if we're at a forest. I remember hearing about this somewhere. And so it was pretty much about tending the plants itself in order for the animals to follow that, which is interesting to think about that. Interesting to think about fire being specifically for the plants.
yes. And that at those early succession stages, that's where you're able to find a lot more of like the medicinal plants and the food plants versus the climax forest old growth. Although there's debate over whether climax forest is even really a thing, or it just continues to evolve and change over time. It's not gonna in like a permanent steady state. But but yeah, this idea that like indigenous peoples have been managing the landscape here for thousands of years and really creating, and to this day, places where indigenous peoples live have so much more biodiversity. And part of that is because they're managing it to have this mosaic of habitat types at different stages. So instead of having only the animals that live at this one particular stage, there you're getting a mix of all these different habitat types and all these different species of plants and species of wildlife and just so much more biodiversity as a whole. And that's because of that relationship between people and plants.
Exactly. And more resilient ecosystems as well, because because of that patchwork. If something a bit more catastrophic, or maybe we should say large scale, happens to one part,
Disturbance.
disturbance, if there's a bigger disturbance in one, then there are more areas that the animals from that area can go into instead of just having nothing, or instead of just having to remain in that one spot and die. So there's more resources around for the animals to be able to move around and get what they need.
I don't know if I thought about it quite that way before.
I think it's something that I'd heard about why about doing controlled burns in certain ways, so that way the animals have a place to go to, so that that way it's not just out of control and everything is burning and the animals are dying.
Hmm.
I think that's what something that I'd heard, but I'd want to research about that.
Yeah, there were
So much.
also controlled burn. Sorry, were you going to say something?
Oh, just happy to realize that there's so much I don't know. I like
Yeah.
that. Or
Yes, there's always so much more to learn. I was just saying we had controlled burns too at back when I worked at the Albany Pine Bush Preserve,
yep,
which yes, and it's a very special kind of ecosystem, and it is at one of those earlier successional stages. It's a lot of scrub oak, which is like an oak tree, but it's like bush sized and it's like bush shaped, and pine trees and the carnauba butterfly, which is endangered, which was my job to count it, and they need the lupin flowers um, to a specific type of wildflower. And um, the whole thing about that particular ecosystem is it's based on like very sandy soils because it used to be these huge sand dunes on the edge of a gigantic lake that doesn't exist anymore, that was in prehistoric times. But anyway, the point is it's this very rare special kind of ecosystem, and so if it wasn't managed, then the trees would migrate in from outside and it would become like a regular forest like all the areas around it. So they actually do controlled burns on a regular schedule to keep it at that stage and keep it as that very unique type of ecosystem, which I assume would have been done by indigenous people before colonization, but I don't know the exact history of that. But it's something a lot of people don't realize is that, fires or disturbances actually are a really healthy and important part of some ecosystems. Sometimes cutting down trees is actually a good thing for the ecosystem in that particular place when it's
exactly.
done with thoughtfulness and care and, research based uh, actions.
Exactly. It's about specific analysis within specific places. It's a lot of tending the wild is not a one size fits all. It's about very much place based. That's another thing that I really value is place based knowledge, which your restoration class teaches in a really deep way and a meaningful way. But then that place based knowledge that we gain and then practice, that gives us that connection that we need, I believe. That makes us really, a lot of people have said this. I'm hearing this in Anne Chadwick's voice. We protect what we love. So the more time we spend knowing that place, the more we'll love it, I believe.
I think so too. And
Hard
I
not
think,
to attention.
what did you just say?
It's hard not to love it when you wind up, as Jack would say, paying that much sustained, compassionate attention. But I interrupted you. What were
Yeah.
you?
Oh, I was just saying, you were talking about the plants becoming more resilient, but I think it makes us more resilient as well. Um, it's hard to be a human, and I think, having that connection to nature in a really deep way that goes beyond just kind of a surface level, like, oh, I like to go hiking sometimes, or I don't really connect to the place or really know anything about it. I mean, that stuff is valuable, but I think like really getting to know the nature around you and having that deep connection, like it just helps a lot with being more resilient to all of life's challenges and having that sense of interconnection, like a sense of being part of something bigger than yourself.
Definitely. Mm, It makes me happy. Any other thoughts about plants?
what's the thought coming up for me right now is just how, so we just spent the past little bit talking about why it's so great to get to know the plants. And I think that nature journaling is such a powerful way of getting to do that. Like every time I sketch something or journal about it, and then I, you know, come across, because if you're just learning like I don't know, watching a lecture or going to like a presentation or a walk or something, and you walk around with the guide and they're like, here's this plant and here's this plant. That can be great, but it's so easy to just forget it. Whereas I went on a trip back in March and there was a plant I didn't know, and I sketched it so that I could look it up later or post a picture on iNaturalist and try to figure out what it was. Um, and it was a toad flax,
Hmm.
which is apparently there's like a whole family of those species. But um, I was looking through a book on native plants for the Northeast that I just got from the library. And again, different region, different species, but there was a toad flax in there. And I'm like, I just have this feeling like, oh hey, I know that guy.
Yeah,
Like it's like it always surprises me when this happens. Like it creates such a stronger memory and such a stronger sense of familiarity.
I love
Even when
that.
you just spend a couple minutes of time just, sketch a picture or something.
It's true. Doing that means that as we are sketching it or describing it, then we're learning at our pace. Um, a lot more our pace than if we were on a guided tour, in my opinion, because we are slowing down our learning and really pausing instead of just learning a name that we'll forget. By doing that, then we have the questions. Like you said, it's like taking a sketch of a person and then trying to match up the person to,
Mm.
and then you're like, oh, it's you.
Right, which would be it's just so much easier to do than when, you're in a big circle of people and everybody goes around and says their name. And by the time it gets to you, you're like, I don't remember what any of your names are.
Exactly. Exactly. And so, yeah, so actually, that reminds me what you said about drawing the plant and then being able to find it more later. That reminds me of something that somebody else in the nature journaling community does. There's an educator named Tara Laidlaw who lives up in Oregon, and she works for a land trust and leads different groups doing different things there. One of the things that she'll sometimes do with them is if they're going to be going out and pulling up a specific plant that day, then she'll have them nature journal the plant for about 10 minutes, the target plant. And then as a result, they are able to identify it correctly every time after that because they spent that time paying attention to who it is. I thought that was brilliant.
That is such a good idea because it's creating those search images in your mind
Exactly.
that you can match it up to something instead of just seeing this wall of green,
Then
which
you,
also reminds me of plant blindness, which is another kind of this idea that like in our modern society people don't pay attention to plants very much. They're just thought of as like decorations or as kind of like a background, and that kids know more brand logos than they do plants, which is really sad. So I think that your class is going to help change that a little bit, though.
thank you. I hope so. I hope if nothing else, it just gets people interested and excited about plants.
Hmm. I also love learning about the interactions of plants and different animals and species, like especially with, native plants. Like earlier, I was talking about how plants have evolved to have different chemical defenses and stuff in their leaves. Um, as people watching this might know, different insects have evolved to be able to eat the plants in a certain area over, their evolutionary history. So that's why certain, species of caterpillars need certain species of plants and the specific host plants. Like I just read that one pair of chickadees needs about 9,000 caterpillars to raise a nest, which is a lot of caterpillars.
A lot.
Um, and so you need to, so if you want to have birds, you need to have caterpillars, then you need to have the plants that those caterpillars can eat. And one thing we were talking about blueberries earlier too. I just learned that so Doug Tallamy, who does all the native plant stuff, has talked about there are certain types of keystone native plants where it's like if you're going to plant only a couple of native plants, then plant these species because they will support the greatest number of caterpillar species. Like oaks are the highest, they can support over 500 species of caterpillars, which means that you get to see over 500 species of really cool moths, which is awesome. But it's also food for baby birds and for adult birds. But I didn't know, I was looking at the list recently of keystone plants for my region, and I didn't know that blueberries are one of the top keystone plants. Like I know there were native species of blueberries, but I didn't know that I forgot the exact number, but it was like in the hundreds of the number of caterpillars, I'm pretty sure. Like they were one of the top five, I think, for my region of so then you get blueberries to eat, and you also get all of the caterpillars and all of the birds. So
That is really cool. I didn't know that the blueberries were a keystone species, but that's really good to know. And I'm betting that like, I'm wondering, especially in the areas that they grow, because being members of the heather family, I think that blueberries tend to prefer soils that are a bit more acidic. I'm
yeah,
wondering if it means that they grow in a bit more specialized environments. And those kinds of environments that have different properties with the abiotic factors, like certain types of rock that are hard for things to grow on, can sometimes have some of the greatest biodiversity as well. Um,
yeah, exactly. Well, in the pine bush ecosystem, like I was talking about before, actually in a different pine bush forest in New York State, but very similar to the one I was talking about. There were lots of blueberries growing there in the wild, and it's got the pine trees, which like the acidic soil. So it's yeah, that depends on the soil type, and I think and the soil type comes from the rocks and the bedrock. So again, talking about deep time, like then you're connecting it to the geologic history, which is hundreds of thousands of years of what went to create this spot being what it is today. So that's that just adds a whole other layer to it.
it does. That's my other love is geology. I don't know nearly as much about geology as I do about plants, but I love geology for that reason. Um, so many different secrets. And like you said, deep time locked in the soils and in the fault lines and in the different rocks and how they are stacked and how they're folded. You feel like if you really get to know the rocks in your area, you might feel as though you're in a lot of different places at once than just your one little area. Like if you're up in the Sierra, the mountain range here in California, you could be on one kind of rock that comes from the deep ocean and was scraped as it rose. Or you can be standing on a rock that was formed from deep within the earth and then rose up and pushed through like a molar or a wisdom tooth. Um, or you could be standing on soil that is the remnants of a glacier that chewed away and that left behind a little something that was maybe easier for other plants to grow in. And so many other histories beyond that. Um, and it's fun. It's like a big puzzle that you're trying to decode and figure out what's where and why is it there and who is benefiting from that and who's growing and did it ruin somebody else's day evolutionarily? um, yeah, that's my other love is geology.
Mm.
Um, but then also you were saying about pollinators, and about the other interactions with other animals. My hope is that in series 3 and 4, I'll be able to go more into pollinator species and interactions with the plants, with plant families in our foods. Is that because I know that that's been a question, and you wind up. It's interesting too to compare wild animal interactions with commercial ones, and to see like for example, what we do with honeybees and why they wind up being so important our to our almonds, but then also how different bees might be really, really important to tomatoes and to blueberries, again with the blueberries. And that's because certain of those species need to be buzz pollinated. They need a very specific thing that the bees do where they have to hold on tight to the anthers and move their muscles in a certain way that cause the plant to vibrate and release its pollen. And we depend on that for certain kinds of fruits that we eat or foods that we eat and to think that each of those needs a very particular kind of pollination is incredible.
Yeah, it's not just the honeybees that people think about. We have so many species of native bees, and they have specific relationships with different types of plants. And there's some plants that only get um, pollinated by a specific species.
Exactly. I love it. It's complicated and beautiful.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Well, is there anything else that you want to talk about?
Um, Trying to think about that. Just that for me, teaching this is especially fun because each time I've taught it, I've learned different things. Even though I've like for series one, I'm teaching the same 8 plant families, and this will be my third time. And one of those other times I taught it twice twice a week. Even though I'm teaching it again, I'm still learning something new each time. And I love that. I love that you can dive as deep as you like into the plant rabbit hole. I've still got like, you can write down all of your questions. You don't have to have them all answered. Another thing, when it
Mm,
comes to identifying plants, um, here's a thing that nobody told me, but that I've learned is that you don't have to rush to identify plants. There will be some cases where you won't be able to identify plants in anything less than a year because you need to be able to see the plant at all of its different stages in the seasons. And and I remember feeling like when I first got into plants pressure, like I had to be able to identify each plant by sight, and you can't always. So in that way, plants do require patience to build a relationship with them. And that can be part of their magic if we let it.
definitely. And then it gets you going back to those same places and going to visit your plant friends again and again throughout the year.
Exactly. I think that was it. That's what I have for now. But
All right. I mean, I know you and I could talk for hours about plants, but we should probably cut it off at some point so that people will actually watch this video instead of getting intimidated by seeing a 4 hour long video. But oh, could you just say again where people can find out where people can go to sign up for your class? Or there's not really a sign up, right? But there'll be a Zoom link. It's on the
yeah,
community calendar, right?
it is.
So it's on
Yeah,
the Wild Wonder website.
it is on that community calendar. I'm I might I might also put I'm have to figure out how it works, but I might try to put also a link on the Facebook as well, or like share a page that says, "Hey, join us here if you like." Um, and then I'm not sure how quickly I can get up recordings, but I also have other past recordings of my plant classes on my YouTube, um,
Mhm.
which just go to Yvea on YouTube or Mad Botanist 415. I think that's my handle. I'm not sure. Um, yeah.
Okay, so it's wildwonder.org, and
Mhm.
then click on events, and then go all the way to the bottom of that list and go to the community calendar, and it will be starting um
On Wednesday, June the 12th.
this. All right. So I hope everybody who's watching this gets excited about plants. Go out and just get excited about them and just start learning things. You don't have to learn all the things. Just start appreciating them and getting excited.
Thank you for this lovely conversation. I love it
Thank
when we
you.
talk about plants.
Yes, I hope we chat again soon. All
Absolutely.
right. The end.